Lately, we've been getting a lot of requests from you guys to give you a tour of our library. Now, don't worry, I know what some of you are probably thinking. Could a library review be any more boring? I mean, let's be honest. Who wants to look at a bunch of stuffy old books? So instead, we've got something special planned for you. So what we're going to do is review the top books in the library, because after thinking about it, what we realized is a lot of you requesting this review want to know about the books in the library so you can build your own library. And we want to help you with that. We want to help you to build your theological, biblical library. We want you to save money, to not make the mistakes we've made buying all these books, some of which we really don't use. Now, I've been asked a lot, Sean, have you read all of the books in your library? And the answer is no. To be honest, a lot of these are reference works, so you wouldn't read every page. Like a dictionary, a thesaurus, or even an encyclopedia, you just use it to hone in on a specific topic. So you're not going to read every page, although I've known some people to do weird stuff like that. So the works or books we're going to cover today in this review are either biblically or theologically focused. And if you guys really found this helpful, what we'll do in a future video is go over all of the apologetics books and other books that I use to support what I'm doing when I do my biblical studies. Okay, so first things first. Our print library has around 1,000 books that deal specifically with biblical topics ranging from Christology or theology proper, which we're going to get into today, to all sorts of topics and a few commentaries. However, I have a digital library as well, and my Logos library has over 16,000 resources. Yeah, and then I have about 200 books in my Kindle library and I don't know, around 100 books in my Audible library as well. So that's a lot of resources. Now, why the print books then? Well, a lot of these I purchased when I was first starting out in ministry, and then over the years, sometimes I really enjoy the feel of a print book, particularly something that I'm going to read through all the way, or I intend to read through all the way. There's just something about having a tangible physical book in my hand. The Logos software is great when I need something quickly. So for instance, if I'm researching sanctification, I can go into the software and type that word in, sanctification, and up pop 100 books. And so from there I can start my research. It's just really, really helpful. It's even more helpful when I do exegesis, which if you guys are interested in how I do that process, let me know in the comments down below, and I'll be sure to cover that in a video sometime. This is the Christology section, right? So it's all the books on Jesus. Then it goes into the resurrection over here, and quickly into angels, Holy Spirit. I don't have a lot on that in my print library. And then into the atonement, right, the salvific work, Soteriology, which then transitions down here. So some of the books I'm going to recommend are going to depend on your current level of education in theology. In other words, if you have an MDiv, Murray J. Harris's book on Jesus is going to be really, really helpful, assuming you've already had your Greek courses. If you understand Greek pretty well, that book is essential. Now, if you haven't had that level of education, it's okay. There's still plenty of books for you. So Metzger's book, titled Lexical Aids for Students of New Testament Greek by Bruce Metzger, is actually a wonderful book, not just for students of New Testament Greek or Koine Greek, but for the layperson wanting to learn a little bit of Greek. Get the alphabet down. Now, I used to have a trick for this when I was in between semesters in college during the summer. I was interning and working for Pastor Tom Messer at Trinity. And what I did was I learned the Greek alphabet, and what I would do is I would use it to write English words. Now that might sound contradictory, but the reason is I didn't have the vocabulary down yet, right? So theos I knew and a few other words, but because I didn't have the vocabulary, I would just write words I knew in English using the Greek alphabet so that I could recognize the letters right away. Then, had I had this resource, I would have been rolling real quick. Because what Dr. Metzger's done, this is really clever, is he's organized the words in the Greek New Testament based on how many times they occur. This is really important. It's very, very helpful to have resources like that, because as you start to read the Greek New Testament, you can recognize a lot of the words being used right away. Kai, and, right? In other words, you start to see that word all the time, and it's like, oh wow, I'm able to read the Greek New Testament. Now I know my MDiv brethren and Greek scholars are pulling their hair out right now, freaking out. And the reason is this: they're going to argue that you need to understand verbal aspect and the tenses and case endings of the words and all of that stuff to really get the most out of the Greek. Otherwise, you won't know how to use it properly. Yeah, some of that is true, but again, to use basic biblical resources, what I've already recommended to you will be tremendously helpful, because as you go through different commentaries, the more academic they are, the tendency is for them to reference Greek words. It's usually just one or two words, and once you understand what that word is, you have a much greater understanding of what they're talking about, and it can be really helpful. So no, you don't need to have that higher understanding of Greek in order to use those resources. So if you guys are enjoying this so far, be sure to hit that thumbs up, and if you really like what we're doing, make sure to subscribe. So many of you watch and you don't subscribe. Okay guys, so back to Christology. Here's the thing. A lot of the resources you need are going to revolve around not just the understanding of Christ's incarnation, Christology proper, but nowadays you're going to need to understand the historical Jesus phenomenon, if you will. In other words, how to argue against this sort of skepticism. The first one is The Evidence for Jesus by R.T. France. The next one is Reinventing Jesus. Now this one by Wallace, Sawyer, and Ed, whose last name I will not attempt to butcher. This is actually a really good book too, though I don't remember a whole lot of it. Now this one by Robert Van Voorst is actually a really good book because it uses outside references, much like Dr. Lycona's book, to show Jesus being spoken about by others who are not inside the New Testament, or non-Christian sources. Very, very good book. Now, if I remember correctly, Maurice Casey's book argues for the fact that Jesus did in fact exist. Again, another good one for arguing against Jesus mythicism. This book by Craig Evans, also a good one, kind of helps to argue against some of the Bart Ehrman type arguments. Again, also aimed at Jesus mythicism to some extent. Although I don't know if he would argue that. Doesn't matter. It's just how I think of it. You may find it more helpful in other areas. Again, good book. Now, this book by Dr. Bach is particularly one of my favorites, and the reason is this. It doesn't just make an argument for the historical Jesus, but also talks about different biblical criticism, source criticism, historical criticism. In other words, it focuses on the methodologies rather than just, hey, here's a bunch of data. One of my favorites. So this book by Murray J. Harris is the one I mentioned earlier. It is brilliant. It deals with roughly 10 verses in the New Testament where Jesus is mentioned or referred to as God. So you can see why this is critically important. Now you're going to need a pretty good understanding of New Testament Greek to follow along and really grasp Murray's points. One of the things I like about it is he does give counter arguments. In other words, he'll say person A argues this, person B argues this. I do feel like he's on the side, and it's pretty obvious, of the fact that all of these verses are arguing that Jesus is God, or they're arguing for his divinity. So I don't think that's in question. For people that are dealing with Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, this can be a great resource, but again, your interlocutor, the person you're arguing or debating with, is going to have to understand New Testament Greek, because this gets really deep, really fast, and you can lose them. And that might sound like a great idea, but to be honest, if you lose the person you're debating with in the argument actually doesn't have the effect that you think it's going to. So, that may be helpful, it may not be. And then throughout the rest of this section of the library, I have your kind of real common textbooks that you would see in an undergrad or grad program that deals with Christology, whether it's the Incarnation or other areas in that topic. These are going to range from Gordon Fee's book to Miller J. Erickson. Great books. Don't get me wrong, but they don't often translate over to apologetics as much, so just keep that in mind. Now this section over here is probably a hot topic right now. A lot of you may be interested in because it's dealing with soteriology, atonement, things of that nature. And I have all kinds of resources. Before I get into that too much, I wanted to talk real quick about the section on defending the resurrection. Now I only have a couple books here, but my Logos library actually has a lot more. The reason I have the print books and not just all the books in Logos for this is that several of these were requirements for Dr. Pritchett's course I took in my grad program on Defending the Resurrection, I think. And so Lycona's book, guys, if you're going to get anything, get that. I'd recommend Dr. Craig's book on The Sun Rises is also kind of really important because a lot of scholarship has been responding to that. Folks are trying to argue against it, and I think that that's really an important book. And then a book that I kind of have a love-hate relationship with was Defending the Resurrection. And in fact, if I remember correctly, Dr. David Wood has a paper in here as well. You can see it was referenced a lot when I was in class. And the reason I say I have a love-hate relationship isn't that the book is bad. It's that some of the arguments that these scholars have to argue against are so bad, it's incredibly frustrating to me to have to read some of these things. They're so painful. Now, moving on to soteriology and the atonement. I know this is going to be a thorny subject, no pun intended, but we need to deal with it. Now, in my library, I have both Calvinist and non-Calvinist resources. I've got stuff also that focuses more on determinism, compatibilism, or the free will perspective, as well as atonement proper, soteriology proper, okay? You are going to see more free will resources, whether that's free grace or provisionalism, whatever those look like. You're going to see more of those resources in my library than the Calvinist ones, because I'm not a Calvinist. But I still have those resources in my library. And again, just because you don't see it here in the print doesn't mean I don't have it in the Logos library. So I do have other books by Calvinists than the ones that are here. So what do I recommend? So one of the books I would recommend in my soteriology section, which is more on the free will side of things, is going to be Dr. Charles Cadwell Ryrie's So Great Salvation. This book is wonderful. Now, while Dr. Ryrie falls into what some people call the free grace camp, he does not hold to what I would call conditional salvation, at least not from how I interpret him. He would not fall into that, oh, if you sin, you're going to lose your salvation camp, okay, that some Arminians do, fall into. The book is short, about 120 pages, give or take. It's just chock full of scripture references. It makes a ton of sense. Dr. Ryrie is no slouch when it came to theology. He's written quite a few books, some of which are in my library. Just a great book. So highly recommended on my part. So in addition, I have a couple of Dr. Leighton Flowers books. One is The Potter's Promise, and then the other is God's Salvation for All, I believe. God's Provision for All. Great books. I also have some of Dr. Craig's books, The Only Wise God, which might seem odd that I would have that in the soteriological section, but the reason for it is it's dealing with the compatibility of divine foreknowledge and human freedom. So hence that sort of free will, are we free or are we determined? Again, that's in this area of my library. And then I have several other books in this portion of the library on free will. Whosoever Will by Alan, and who's that by Lemecki? Sorry. And then I haven't had a chance to read that one yet. And then Rogers, Does God Love All or Some? That is a good book. I haven't had a chance to read all of it, but I have gone through some of it. I also have one book right now in my print library on Molinism. At the time when I bought this, probably 10 years ago, it was the only book that I could find in print on the topic. And it's, if I remember correctly, it's not written by one person. It's a compendium of different papers. Yeah, that's right. And so it's titled The Contemporary Debate. Again, dust jackets gone because I hate dust jackets. They just tend to get in the way. Okay guys, so now the theology proper area. This is really divided into three basic categories, and if you've gone through an MDiv program or perhaps your undergrad theology program, you're going to understand how I've divided these. And that's by systematic theology, biblical theology, and then historical theology. And that's sort of the order it goes in here. Some of these don't really fit into those categories, so forgive me. I've kind of placed them just where they're the most helpful to me in the library. So if you see one and think, why is your dispensational biblical theology there in this section? It should be in another section. Whatever. It's my library. Which one of these books would I recommend? If you could only get one, I would recommend Dr. John S. Feinberg's No One Like Him. Now, if you know anything about Dr. Feinberg, yes, he is a Calvinist, okay? Still, this is an awesome book. If you're a huge fan of the work of Dr. William Lane Craig, particularly if you've watched some of his Defenders series classes that he teaches, you will recognize that style in this. Now, I'm not saying that he taught Dr. Feinberg. I'm just saying they're very similar in the way they approach it. Dr. Feinberg, when he deals with the material in here, does it from a systematic, historical, and biblical theology perspective. So even though you might look at this and say, well, it's organized like a systematic theology, it still treats the material in a very well-rounded way, approaches it from a sort of philosophical leaning of being rational about the way he's going to do it. And he also has some great topics in here that are typically not in a systematic theology, like God and time. Really wonderful resource. And again, I love the fact that he's fair about the way he treats everything. So even if you don't have the same view as him, he's not being vitriol about it. If you don't agree with him, it's totally fine. And I really love that. If you could only have one book out of this section of my library, this is the one I would recommend. It's wonderful. And in fact, just to emphasize how much I use this, I don't know if it'll show up on the video, but it's literally like dirty in this section where I've got these markers from use so much from me flipping through it. I've even used this to teach my older kids theology. I mean, it really is a wonderful book. And then throughout the rest of the library, you'll see that I've got books by Erickson. Adam Harwood's new book on Christian theology is great because it's from a provisionalist perspective. But I have a lot of Calvinist books or folks that are compatibilists like Dr. Geisler. Grudem, I don't know where yes, he's a Calvinist. I don't know how you put him on that spectrum. It doesn't matter. Again, guys, notice my library has books from everybody. I've got Zuck in here, who's kind of pretty much free grace. He and Bach did a book, Biblical Theology of the New Testament. I've got dispensationalist stuff here. A lot of these guys are covenant theologians. It doesn't matter. Just because they don't have your exact point of view doesn't mean you can't learn something from them. So throw that garbage out the window, this whole they're not in my camp thing, and let's start thinking logically, clearly about topics rather than whether or not somebody's in the same camp as me. Okay? So then this section down here is really where the historical theology starts. Now, I don't have a lot of books right now in my print library in this section. That's because more of them are in my Logos library. It's just how that worked out. These books tend to be very expensive, and so over the years, as I've had to get them for my courses and whatnot, I have to be careful about, what I purchase. Allison's book on historical theology is one that some of you will be familiar with. The Story of Christian Theology by Olson is actually pretty good, though I haven't had a chance to dive into it, from front to back so far. Now, some of you at this point may be saying, Sean, what about the Trinity? Well, don't worry, I got that covered. Again, just because you don't see a book here in the print library doesn't mean I don't have it. It's just not in my print library. However, here I have about 16, 17 books on the Trinity. So the section here on the Trinity is quite deep, and it's not just deep theological books. I have some really fundamental ones by like Dr. White, by Saunders. So there's some pretty classic staples, if you will, books that those that study theology are familiar with. And then there are some Two Powers in Heaven, which deals with rabbinical writings about, hey, wait a minute, we say we're monotheists, but there seems to be these two beings spoken about throughout the Tanakh, that of the angel of the Lord versus God proper. So they were already identifying that there were these beings that seemed to make up a duality, all right? And so a binity, if you will, right? A bi instead of a trinity. Anyway, sorry, bad joke. So throughout the library, some of the books are going to deal with this subordinationism and eternal generation topics. If you're familiar with the Trinity, you already know what I'm talking about. And then same thing with eternal generation. I have books on that, defending eternal generation. I have books looking at it going, well, wait a minute, what's the deal here? So in this book, Philosophical and Theological Essays on the Trinity, it's really a compendium, a collection of different academic papers. And you have great authors in here. I mean, you have Richard Swinburne, or Dr. Swinburne, William Hasker. Again, a lot of these guys have PhDs. I don't mean to be rude. Dr. William Lane Craig. You just got some great papers in here. And again, for and against some of these positions. If you're not familiar with the landscape of Trinitarian theology, I would not start with this book. If you are familiar, this is actually a great book for that. So as you can see, I have several books in this section, and it's a wide variety of different topics, even within Trinitarianism. I even have De La Cruz's The Magnificent Three, Nicky Cruz, excuse me. He was a former, I think, gang member somewhere in New York, and he wrote this. It's at a very popular level, but it's a really cool book. So it's worth a read. I have a lot of books in this part of the library, but to be honest, I wouldn't recommend them all. And that's not to say that the ones I'm not recommending are bad. All I'm saying is that they're each focused on something very specific. And depending on your needs, the book may or may not really target what you're looking for. And that's what makes it so difficult to shop for these books. I mean, I'll give you an example again. Feinberg's No One Like Him. With that title, you wouldn't realize what the book is actually about. In fact, you might totally miss it or have never have heard of it, but it's an exceptional book on, kind of from a systematic theology perspective, even though he deals with all three of those major branches on every topic. So it's really a great book. Of all the books, that one and Dr. Ryrie's So Great Salvation are probably my top two. But again, there's so many, it depends on what you're looking for. Okay guys, so for now that's it. I hope you've enjoyed this. I've had a ton of fun showing you some of my favorite books in the library, and I hope it helps you to build your library and to save money. If it has, hey, give us a like. Love y'all. Take care. God bless.